Over the last 2 years, India is being increasingly seen as a leader of the global south. This is also a time when Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said that this is not an era of war, but wars continue. India has also positioned itself at the center as an independent voice between China, Russia, and the United States. How did this happen under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and what is the road ahead? Joining us is Honorable Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. I want to begin by asking you on something that you said last year. You said, I would like to see 21st century as the India century, and it's better than having a Chinese century. Why did you say that?
I've long said that India is the emerging democratic superpower. India is a well-established and resilient democracy under the rule of law. China, by contrast, remains a communist dictatorship. India has been a benign superpower of the subcontinent. China, by contrast, is continually bullying its neighbours, even India, and it is routinely threatening Taiwan across the straits. Now, this is a very serious situation. We have to take the words of the commissars in Beijing seriously. They are constantly threatening to take Taiwan by force, and they are regularly boasting that they will be the global hegemon by mid-century. And we can't just brush that off and say that's just bluster for domestic consumption. Dictators whose rule is based on fear can't afford to make threats that they don't carry out. That's why I think this is a fraught time in the life of the world, and it's more important than ever that the democracies work together. And that means India taking its rightful place on the world stage as a force for peace, for justice, and for development.
Well, you also said recently that India is an upcoming democratic superpower. Do you say this as opposed to China? And how does one deal with China? You said that China is a big bully and the big elephant in the room yet. And in this new international order, when India has already faced Galwan, we've seen the situation developing in Taiwan. We've also seen situation developing in the South China Sea, several countries bearing the brunt of the same. How does a coalition like the Quad in the Indo-Pacific really check China's intimidation and not agreeing to a rules-based order?
Well, the only way to deal with the bully is to stand up to them. And weakness is provocative, and this is why it's important for the democracies to stand shoulder to shoulder whenever the Beijing government threatens any of its neighbours. Now, that doesn't mean that every democracy has to agree with every other democracy all the time. Obviously, India and the United States differ somewhat on the Ukrainian situation, for instance, although I stress I have not met a single Indian who doesn't think that what Putin is trying to do is not evil. I think everyone accepts that it is evil what's happening there. But there can be differences, but on the big things, I think there needs to be a degree of democratic solidarity, a strong democratic partnership, and that's what the Quad is. And let's face it, the Quad is only here because India, for the first time in its independent existence, has been prepared to dip its feet into the waters of commitment. India has been prepared to make a geostrategic commitment in a way that prior to Narendra Modi it never really was, and this is a sign A of India's growing maturity as a civilizational power, and B of the considerable gifts of Narendra Modi as a global statesman.
Therefore, do you also believe that we are living in a time when there's increased emphasis and belief in shared interests rather than shared values? And also, do you think that we are living in a time when trade, connectivity, global supply chains, and economics play an increasingly important role, and your belief in friend shoring and trust shoring?
Economics is always very important. And yes, countries should, within reason, pursue their national interests. But it is also important to acknowledge the fundamental decencies of mankind, and at the heart of that is the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And the great thing about the benign democracies, and certainly India comes into that category as far as I'm concerned, and I also think that for all its occasional errors of judgment, so does the United States. The benign democracies are marked by a readiness to do things for the greater global good, which aren't necessarily in their interests. For instance, you can argue the strategic pros and cons of American actions in recent times in Iraq and Afghanistan. You can argue the tactics in both Iraq and Afghanistan, but there is no way that America was not involved in both of those countries in an attempt to do the right thing by the people of those countries, in an attempt to end a brutal dictatorship in the case of Iraq and a monstrous Islamist dictatorship in the case of Afghanistan. Now, as I said, you can argue endlessly about the detail, but at least the purpose was fundamentally benevolent, to bring a measure of peace and justice to lands that had not known that. And that's, I think, why, frankly, the world under maybe Anglo-American leadership over the last 7 decades, for all its ups and downs, has been on balance more free, more fair, more safe, and more rich for more people than at any time in human history. Unfortunately, I think when we look back on these times, we may well see the pandemic and subsequent events such as the Ukraine war, such as the attack on Israel, such as the growing tension in the Taiwan Straits, as the harbingers of a darker time.
Well, in this deeply divided world, already because of the Russia-Ukraine war, over the last 5 months, we see another conflict developing, and that's between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. We've already seen thousands of lives being lost in that area. Also, if I can take back you to the G20 in New Delhi, where on the sidelines, a successful economic corridor was achieved between Europe, Middle East, and South Asia. And this war, unfortunately, has hit a major roadblock, not just for this, but normalization of ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia as well. How do you see this conflict developing? Do you see that this will not only be a new reality for Gaza, but perhaps the larger Middle East?
I think we have to approach all these conflicts with a degree of intellectual and, dare I say it, moral clarity. What Putin is doing in Ukraine is evil. What Hamas did in Israel is evil. What China would like to do in Taiwan is evil. Now, there's different degrees, I suppose, and there's certainly different elements of rationality in the actions that we're discussing. But nevertheless, Hamas's objective to entirely destroy the Jewish state and to expunge Jews in what we once called the Holy Land is simply evil. It would amount to a new Holocaust. Now, I don't see the Israeli government or the Israeli people as wanting any harm at all to individual Palestinians. I do see them quite rightly wanting to destroy Hamas as a political actor. Now, the tragedy is Hamas uses civilians, its own people, as human shields, and when you've got a movement, a vicious movement, which is hiding behind innocent people, it's very difficult to take the necessary action without civilian casualties. But to the Israeli government and the Israeli military's credit, they have done their literal level best to try to avoid them. But we cannot expect a casualty-free campaign. We have to accept that regrettably there will be casualties. Some of them will be innocent people, but the world will undeniably be a better place without an apocalyptic movement such as Hamas.
Finally, Honorable Abbott, you have had a very important chemistry and friendship with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi over the years, over the last perhaps a decade. And India-Australia ties have also grown and has had a paradigm shift in these years. How do you see, one, the relationship growing further, trade, economics, the free trade agreement, and apart from that, how do you see leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, because he's going into elections in a couple of months from now, and if pollsters are to be believed, he's certainly going to come back with even bigger margin?
Well, yes, I have a lot of admiration for Narendra Modi, who has been a transformative leader at both a domestic and an international level. And while I don't presume to advise the Indian people on how they should vote, I personally would love to see leadership of Prime Minister Modi's stature continue. The relationship between India and Australia is indeed strong and getting stronger. The people-to-people links are growing all the time, thanks to the ECTA trade agreement, which Prime Minister Modi and I began back in 2014 and which came to fruition more recently. It's all upside in terms of trade and investment, but importantly the security and strategic cooperation is increasing. India is now participating in our major military exercises such as Talisman Sabre. Australia is now participating substantially in India's major exercises, the Malabar exercises. And I would like to see the kind of leadership that Narendra Modi has exercised locally and globally in terms of significant economic reform, in terms of practical measures to help the life of ordinary people, and in terms of being prepared to stand up for justice and decency around the world. I'd like to see more of it. I really would like to see more of it. I think we've seen too many significant leaders who have engaged in false moral equivalence when considering conflicts, who have put geopolitical fashions ahead of the best long-term interests of their people. And to Prime Minister Modi's credit, he's almost never fallen into that trap.
Well, Honourable Tony Abbott, thank you very much for joining us here.
Thank you.